My name is Celine Coggins, and I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education. And this is probably as good a moment as any to get underway. So welcome. I am so very excited about today. I am so very excited for our whole world to get to know our new Chief Program Officer here at Grantmakers for Education. So we have teamed up with Nora Flood from the Wend Collective just to join us and have a conversation with our new Chief Program Officer, Ulcca Joshi Hansen. I'm going to say a little bit about Ulcca, I'm going to say a little bit about Nora, and then I'm going to turn things over to them. So Ulcca joins us with a really just fantastic background in all aspects of education and philanthropy. In the early stages of her career, she was an elementary school teacher in Newark. She also worked for the Dodge Foundation. And she's gone on to lots of different really cool roles in education. She has a PhD, she has a JD, she has been a plenary speaker at the GFE annual conference, so many of you will recognize her. And she's got a book coming out this fall called The Future of Smart, some extra words that I can't remember right now. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And then I wanted to, and then she's going to be joined today and kind of interviewed by Nora Flood. Nora is with our member organization, the Wend Collective, and she's in Colorado as well, just there with Ulcca. And so I'm going to turn things over to Nora and Ulcca for a conversation that we invite the rest of you to jump in on over time. Take it away.
Thank you, Celine. Ulcca, you want to say good morning?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Glad to be here.
It's really an honor to be able to interview my good friend and colleague and fellow education rabble rouser, Ulcca Joshi Hansen. Ulcca and I actually have crossed paths in the Colorado education ecosystem for years and years. But I really got to know Ulcca 4.5 years ago, I guess, about that, when she started doing research for the book that has now become The Future of Smart. And we were actually able to travel across the country to urban, suburban, and rural areas with locally facilitated focus groups, asking parents the question, what is it that you really want from education for your children as they grow into being young adults? What is it that you hope for them? What are your aspirations for them? And it was fascinating. And I got to know a bit about Ulccas philosophy around learning and education and child-centered and student-centered, learner-centered education, and what that looks like to really personalize per child, rather than having it be, what we know as the industrial model of education. And it was just fascinating. And from then, she and I have crossed paths, right? Ulcca and I have crossed paths in many different iterations through Education Reimagined and through the continuation of her research into the book, through her participation in something that was called the Iterative Space, which was just literally a space for educators in Denver last summer that we helped to support, where they could come together and just be thought partners and collaborators on projects. And so she's got this amazing background that I could never do it justice to actually introduce her. So if it's all right, Ulcca, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a bit about your background, your journey, and your experiences. And I think this will give you a really good sense of who Ulcca is and what her orientation toward both children and learning are. And it's based on who you are, Ulcca. So it's really an honor to be here to interview you. If you would please share something.
Oh my gosh, nice big open question, Nora.
Well, let's put it this way, particularly share about what you mean when you say that you're a third culture kid. When I heard that, it really intrigued me. So
great. No, that I first heard that term a few years ago, and it's used to describe somebody who's raised by parents who were raised in one culture, but grows up themselves in a second culture, and then spends at least kind of some portion of their formative years, right, from birth to about 25, in a third kind of culture that's different from the first two. And I had no idea this was a thing. But the research into it, when I started digging into it, it sort of helped me make sense of myself in some really important ways. Because the way they describe us is as kind of cultural nomads, in the sense that because we're living in so many different worlds and so many different spaces in our formative years, we sort of have this ability to move across them. And that comes with benefits and it comes with some challenges. The benefits are, I think we get to learn really early how to see and understand people across different perspectives and sort of be in relationship to them in different ways. And I think the challenging side is that you don't ever feel like you belong. You kind of sit on the edge of the places that you are without fully integrating in. And I think when I was writing the book, I wrote the author's note, and as I was having to do that, it helped me make sense of why I think I was so compelled by the types of environments I saw in schools, both as a teacher and doing research and working in foundations, but schools and programs that made belonging kind of the central organizing principle of the work that they did, that everything emerged out of relationships, out of human beings being known sort of as their full selves, and then building everything outward from that. So when it comes to education, and I think back to my own experiences, I think we can all remember kind of those one or two teachers that kind of has a huge impact. I invited two teachers to my wedding, my French teacher and then Mrs. Ollinger, who was my reading teacher and English teacher from 5th through 8th grade. And Mrs. Ollinger's whole philosophy was, I want you to learn to think, I want you to learn to read, I want you to learn to write. How you do that, I really don't care. And so I want you to follow your interests. And so for 4 years, she gave us permission to say, what are the questions you're interested in? What are the issues that you're interested in exploring? And gave us a lot of bandwidth to explore those. So I kind of tell people that was my time. There was an author named Lois Duncan who wrote about ESP and parapsychology and reincarnation and all sorts of things, loved her books. So I read my way through the 0 to 100 section of the library, which was all about kind of astrology and witchcraft and that type of thing. And that got me really interested in history. And what was happening in Europe when they decided to burn women and call them witches, right? So all these kind of random things, which over time developed my own interest in kind of history, in culture, in the development of culture and sort of ideologies, in the brain, what we know about the brain, what we don't know about the brain, which then led to learning. So I think when I think about my educational philosophy, right, my real interests are, how do we start with the person? How do we give space for each person to really think about and give space for who they are and who they want to be in the world and where that intersection and that fit is? And how do we then organize learning experiences that honor that unique potential, honor what we know about human development and the stages of learning? And then how do we do it in a way that honors what we know about different brains and how we all learn to be in the world in really different ways?
Thank you. That's fascinating. And for those of you who really don't know Ulcca yet, you're going to want to sit and have a glass of wine with her at one of the conferences when we are all in person again, which is tick, tick coming. It really is. Because Ulcca's family is Indian, moved from Tanzania to the States, and then realized that they were not able to send Ulcca to the, and your sister, just you?
Just me at the time.
To the kinds of schools that they wanted. And so sent her back to Tanzania to live with her aunties and her extended family. And so she's got this really broad view of what education looks like, not only across geographic areas within the United States, but also internationally. And I value that in you, Ulcca, because you've seen such a broad range of what education can look like, should look like, and shouldn't look like. And so I think that's wonderful. Thank you. So how did all of this influence how you think about educational equity? So what, it's kind of the new term, right? Everything is around educational equity. What does that actually mean to you based on your background and your experiences?
So I always go back to, and I'm sure we all know this image, right? There was this kids on a baseball field or right at the outside of a baseball field, and it's got 3 pictures in it. And I've always wanted to add a 4th. So the first picture was you have kids standing there, they're different heights, and some can see over the fence and other kids can't. And that's kind of where we started. And the conversation, I think, around equity kind of in the 90s, kind of 80s and 90s started to be, well, how do you give different kids different things so they can be the same height and kind of all see over the fence? And I might be like jumping now to the third one. But, you know, I think we've had this idea that inside the existing system, equity is about trying to make sure that we all kind of get to the same place, are able to see over the fence, are able to access the same content, the same opportunities. And I totally agree with that. And yet that image to me has always been, it hasn't quite worked, because what I want is to see the fence taken down. I want to see some kids going on the field and playing baseball. I want to see some painting the fence. I want to see some building something else with the fence. I want to see some sitting on the side and not watching the baseball game at all, because it sort of gets to the idea of each of them being able to relate to the space that they find themselves in the way that they want. And I think in our effort to try and make sure that we served all kids well, we somehow have flattened everyone a little bit and sort of forgotten or not paid as much attention as I hope we will do to their uniqueness, to the uniqueness both of what they bring to the world, but also who they want to be in the world. And so what I would like to think is that we can build a system that isn't human proof, right? In the sense that I think our accountability systems over the last kind of 20 years have tried to impose something that we worried would, you know, wasn't something that adults would kind of take on by themselves. So in other words, we all have bias, we have unconscious things that we bring to the table, and therefore we might treat students differently. So we want to try and make sure that all kids are treated the same. And it just felt like it's gone a little bit too far. And I think it's time to sort of bring that back. And for better or for worse, I think the world right now is in a place where we need different brains, we need different minds, we need different passions, we need people to come to the table with their uniqueness so that we can work together collectively to deal with really complex problems and opportunities in our world. So for me, that's when I think about educational equity, it's kind of that texture to it that I hope we'll get to.
I love that. Thank you. I'm going to start asking Ulcca a series of questions that I hope will inform a little bit about who she is, about what her views on education are, and about her new role. But I invite any of you, please feel free to either raise your hand, put a question into the chat box, and we'll make sure that if something strikes a chord with you, if you'd like to have Ulcca extend some conversation, please feel free to ask at any point. This is really just a conversation. As a matter of fact, I can't even see you. So this is really just a conversation between Ulcca and me. So please feel free to raise your hand or to put something into the chat box. Thank you so much. So I think the first question then is actually based on a lot of that, Ulcca, and it's, how do you see the role of philanthropy in this time of racial reckoning and through this pandemic? And I'll have you speak to that, because I also know that you developed a program called Silk Strand that's focused on racial dialogue. So can you talk about all of that and about your work and your approach through Silk Strand?
Yeah. So I'll back up for a second, and I'm laughing at this because my husband Chris always tells people, like, I don't do a good job at cocktail party conversations because I have the glass of wine and I just like talk and talk and talk and talk. So that's just like fair warning. I always kind of zoom out and then I zoom back in, and the answer is in paragraphs and not sentences. But I think I'm a philosopher by training, and I think both through my own experience and kind of what I've seen in the world, I've been really intrigued by a researcher named Edwin Nichols, who talks about kind of the cultural underpinnings of, or the kind of philosophical aspects of cultural difference. So he talks about how do different cultures think about our value systems, what it is to know, how we navigate our way through the world. And if I had to simplify it down, right, I would say that in the last 500 years, we used to be human beings that lived kind of in this ecological, more holistic kind of way of knowing the world, of being in relationship with each other. And over the last 500 years, there's been a worldview that emerged that was a little bit more kind of individualistic, a little bit more linear, a little bit more sequential, that kind of has informed a lot of what happened in Europe and what happened in the US And that stands sort of in contrast with this other way of being, which is a little bit more emergent. It's a little bit more relational. It's a little bit more, again, just sort of textured, because it's about the natural world, right? And our natural ways of being. So I say all that because, at least for me, a large part of the way in which we need to think about the challenges that we're grappling with is about how we help the solutions to that emerge from sort of ourselves as people and our relationships with each other. That at a certain point, you can't mandate diversity. You can't mandate that people get along or know each other. And so partly, I think, because I've lived in lots of different places and have had to sort of go through that process of getting to know folks and building connections, for me, a large part of that has always been about breaking bread. It's about creating spaces where you bring people together to have a chance often to do something that isn't about the ideas that we're wrestling with or the problems we're trying to solve, but it's actually about just being in relationship with one another. And then out of that comes a very different way in which we can relate to each other and to the work that we're trying to do together. So Silk Strand, to answer your question, was a racial dialogue workshop that a colleague and I developed that sits at the intersection of racial dialogue and intersectional feminism. So the approach was really, how do we use, the different ways that we all experience not belonging or being different or sitting inside of a world or a culture that doesn't always appreciate who we are? How do we use our individual entry points to kind of start to see and engage in this bigger conversation about racial justice, about the kind of worldviews and values that allowed us to create a world in which we dehumanized human beings, allowed ourselves to treat some people as worthy and others who are not, and to build systems that really embedded that value from the top all the way down to the bottom. And so Silk Strand was really about trying to help people understand that whatever you want to call it, modern Western supremacy culture, white supremacy culture, white advantage, right? That construct, it is harmful to all of us because it's actually dehumanizing all of us in different ways. So I think when I think about philanthropy and I think about its role at this moment, it feels like what America, some people, Cornell Brooks talks about it, right, as dual pandemics. We're seeing it across all these systems, our economic system, our healthcare system, our social welfare system, our education system. I feel like we're having this debate about two very different sets of values. Do we have a world that has kind of systematized our humanness out of us and sort of is in service of some sort of ideals, but we sort of forget our humanity inside of that? Or are we trying to sort of build systems that kind of rehumanize us and allow us to both be individually and be collectively, like in different ways? So when I think about philanthropy, right, which is about loving humanity and loving people, it feels like philanthropists have this amazing opportunity to invest in the type of long-term, subtle efforts, in addition to the kind of initiatives and programmatic work that we do. But philanthropy and philanthropists, I think, have the privilege to be able to see a big picture, to understand that we don't get there in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, but to invest in things that have concern to both the where we're trying to go, but also the how we get there. That gives time for process, that gives time for community engagement, that gives time for, things to emerge and to be emergent rather than be solutions that are imposed from the top down. And so I think it's one of the sectors, it's why it's so exciting to be at GFE at this moment, as we think about kind of racial justice in education and all of the associated systems, because it feels as though philanthropy has an opportunity to kind of pull back, learn from the last kind of 20 to 30 years of what we've done, and to kind of think deeply about the types of values that our programming and our work wants to facilitate and to kind of lift up for others to learn from.
It's so inspiring. And I want you all to know that although Ulcca defines herself as a philosopher, she's also an amazing systems designer and program designer. So as far as how to approach this, the problem is part of the wonderful solution, right? And so it is both really examining a problem, but then deciding how we all can collectively or individually address the problems within this. And that's, I think, one of your gifts as well, Ulcca. So thank you for that very much. So you led into another one of this is my first philanthropic role. I was a teacher and a principal for 30 years. I ran a nonprofit that was always the grantee, never the grantor, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. And so this is my first philanthropic role as well. And I grapple with it. I grapple with the power and the privilege of philanthropy as well, and the power of grant making. So how do you see the difference between philanthropy and grant making? Are they synonymous? I think some of us think they are. I would like to think they were different. But how do you see the difference between philanthropy and grant making? Or is there one?
No, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think just even from the roots of it, right? Philanthropy to me, again, is this kind of bigger picture, which is when we say we want to love human beings, or when we say that we want to improve the lives of others, what are the values that undergird that? Do we think that it is something we have an idea about and that we impose on other people? Is it a sort of an approach to this where we say, who are people, what do they need, and how do we help them become and to do what they need to do? So I think there's a values question deeply embedded in the question of what philanthropy is. So what is it we are trying to do? How do we kind of think about the values that we want to live out? And then grant making to me feels like it's about the tools that we use to do that. So I think they're related, because if there are certain values you want to put forward, you may choose different tools. So, right, just as an example, when my first work with a philanthropic organization, we were having a lot of conversations at Dodge under a new executive director about what it meant for us as folks who were in the program role to really get to know our grantees, to really go out and to think about who were the communities they were serving, what were the needs that they were trying to kind of address, and then what did that mean in terms of our grant making? Did it make sense to do year by year grants? Did it make sense to do general operating grants that really gave them a lot of freedom and a lot more freedom and flexibility around what it was that they needed to do and how they needed to do it? How do we think about measurement? And assessing outcome and impact? Was it just numbers, the numbers of people served in the arts, how many people came to a performance? Or was it about the experience that people had of the artistic performance or of the program that they had just taken part in, right? So all of those to me were the conversations about the specific tools that we wanted to use as grant makers and philanthropists to sort of get to the ends. And there was a real attention, I think, there to process and relationship, in addition to, did we start arts programs in schools, or how many schools were we funding, or how many environmental projects were we funding?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go to a question that's in the chat, because that lines up and will pivot to the other question I wanted to ask, which this is all kind of connected in that. The question came in from Celine about, what did you learn about learning in school by having your own children doing school from home over the past year? And if you knew her two boys, they're amazing and really out of the box thinkers. I don't know where that came from.
No,
so what did you learn? And then I'm going to go back to the next question, which is directly related.
I mean, I'll just back up. And for any of us who are parents, I think we all know this kind of really lovely tension that exists between who you aspire to be as a parent and a person, and whatever, and then who the humans are that kind of end up with you. I think for me, what became super obvious as they were both from home, they were both at a expeditionary learning school in Denver that I think was just kind of struggling with what it was doing. And I knew that that was true. I knew that for one of my children, that program was working. And I knew for my other son that he struggled with it. But having them at home and letting me see sort of who they were and how they were both experiencing this program that I thought Deep in My Guts was a really great program, right? It was sort of inquiry based. It was letting them explore, letting them figure things out on their own. One of them was thriving and I could see it. I could see him finishing his work and then taking that curiosity and that kind of passion and going out and doing other things. You know, he watched all of Grey's Anatomy and he decided he wanted to be a surgeon. And so he bought a suture kit and taught himself to suture, and he got a pig off the internet and like dissected it on the back table, right? And he started a baking business, like that was him. And then I was watching my younger son really struggling because he wanted more structure. He wanted somebody to kind of be there with him by his side, kind of taking him through it, which is so different philosophically from what I kind of think is a really good way to do education. And so I think it was just one thing was that I was reminded about the fact that when we think about human-centered or learner-centered or student-centered education, the point is not about our philosophical sense of what it is they're supposed to experience. It's about seeing them and being able to give them what they need and to sort of build the scaffolding around them that allows them to kind of succeed and thrive. So that was one. And I was just reminded again of how arbitrary our conversations about learning are. I was seeing them learning in different ways, in super important ways. Some of it was relational, spending a ton of time with each other. It was about what do you do when the world kind of stops and you have to figure out what you're going to do with your time. It was about resilience. It was about what do I do when I'm a middle schooler and can't see kids my own age. So there's a lot of learning that happened. And I think it's been one of the things I've been thinking about a lot as we're thinking about going back to school and thinking about, you know, the conversations we're having about whether it's accelerating into learning or learning loss, or I'm like, how do we start from the asset-based frame of what did they do? What did they learn about themselves, about the world, about the people around them? And then to start from there to think about kind of re-engaging them in their education, whatever that's going to look like over the next year.
You know, it's so interesting because I can tell you get emotional about this. And for any of us who have school-age children who have struggled this past year, I give you grace and respect for trying to carry on with lives as usual and be supportive and positive and present for your children as well. So I give you a lot of grace and respect there. Thank you. I think it's also interesting about thinking about going back and thinking about the language of learning loss. And if I could encourage this group to do anything, it is to lose the language of learning loss. Let's lose that language and become more asset-based. And again, whether it is accelerating learning, whatever it is, because I think the reflection on youth, I think the reflection on teachers, I think the deficit base of learning loss is not helpful. So that's my little get me on my bandstand, but I would love to have us lose the language of learning loss. So that's a challenge for all of us. So based on what you learned this last year from your own children's experience, based on the research that you did for your new book, shameless plug for the book, The Future of Smart, but having been through that journey with you as you researched for the future of smart, how do we measure learning? What are the metrics that we in philanthropy and grant making, how do we measure impact?
Again, small question, Nora. Yeah. I mean, so I'll just back up because you've mentioned the book a couple of times, right? And so just to give a little bit of context, there's kind of three categories that I think about schools in. So I think about what I call conventional, which is the factory model school that we all, are recognizing has real shortcomings. There's this big bucket in the middle that's like 90% of what we have out there that I think of as whole child innovative reform, which is we're still operating off the same foundational assumptions of the factory industrial model, but we recognize the shortcomings of it, right? Whether it's kids aren't getting kind of socio-emotional opportunities to grow, that kids aren't allowed to engage in projects, that we're not being culturally responsive in our practice. And so we sort of bolt on individual solutions to the existing system to try and mitigate it. And then the third bucket is what I would call human-centered liberatory, which emerges out of a very, very different set of values and assumptions about what the purpose of education is, about who kids are, who they can and should be in relationship to their own learning, and what the outcomes are that we're trying to get to. And I think this year has strengthened my conviction that we need to sort of go back to this idea of asking young people, asking communities, and really thinking about how we create a system that can be more flexible for them, as we try and sort of design a system that's going to look different and address the really diverse, varying needs of kids and communities as we go back into it. So when I think about how we measure impact, there's so many layers to this. I think we need to recognize that there's so much of the learning that has happened that is going to be super hard, if not impossible, to measure through the types of metrics that we've had, whether it's kind of standardized tests, written tests, that type of thing. So I think, we need to be really clear on helping young people and their families and their educators kind of articulate where it is that they're trying to go. And we need to be measuring our ability to help them kind of get from kind of where they are to where they want to go. So it's a process question, right? How are we creating the room and the space for them to define success in the ways that they need to? How are we giving them time and space in not 1 month, 9 month, year cycles, I think, to kind of do that, right? Honoring that it's going to look uneven. I think we do need to be thinking a lot, at least for me, like part of what the pandemic did was it bust open a lot of our assumptions about why we couldn't change the system that we had, right? We couldn't possibly think about not having kids in school. We couldn't possibly think about not covering the same content for all children of the same age at the same time. We couldn't think about flexible ways for adults to use their time. We couldn't imagine that there could be adults that were not teachers in schools that were sort of helping to facilitate learning, whether it was out of school program providers, kind of social program providers. So I think one of the things we should probably be doing as we build back is to be asking ourselves, to what extent are we just building back the system that we had versus really using this opportunity and the room that's been created to kind of build new ways of operating that reflect kind of different values. So you and I think, had this conversation. Wouldn't it be fascinating if we were able to try pilots of multi-age classrooms? You've got kids coming back who are going to be in all different places across basic subjects, across basic skills. Why do all 7-year-olds need to be together? Why couldn't you put 7, 8, and 9-year-olds together in the way that Montessori, for example, does, where there are opportunities for them to learn and grow from each other across a range of areas, because they're all going to be in different places anyway. And the pandemic has made that obvious. So I think it's, how do we meet the needs of young people where they are? How do we invest in the kind of processes and the programs that we need to be able to be really clear about that? How do we engage communities in really asking, where do we want to get to, as opposed to assuming that we know where communities want to go? How do we track our sort of processes and our ways of investing to make sure that happens? And then I would say, are we attending to kind of what we can put in place and what we can do that's going to bridge us from where we've been to where we've been saying we want to go, but could never quite figure out how to do it. And the pandemic has sort of given us this moment to say, all right, like, we're going to take that risk. We're going to take a portion of our efforts, our money, our time, our investments, and really kind of go into that future facing work to see what we can build.
Yeah, I love that. I don't think any of us would have wished this past year on anyone.
No.
And yet there is the old adage of out of crisis comes opportunity. And so I don't think anybody is talking about, like, it's like defunding police, right? It's that kind of language. Nobody's trying to blow up the systems that exist. It's how do we reshape, reinvent the systems that exist to make them more child-centered and family-centered and community-centered. I think that's right.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the cultural things that we grapple with is often this either or, that it's got to be this or it's got to be that. And I just think the more we can do a both and approach, which is we can meet the urgent and the immediate needs of young people, of educators, of families, of communities, we can do that. And we can also be kind of playing a long-term game that allows us to kind of go somewhere different or be somewhere different in 10 years than we might have been if we hadn't been attending to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not a zero-sum game.
It's not.
And I think that's how we have tended to think about a lot of things in the current political and socio structures. Okay, so that leads me, we've gone kind of macro in who Ulcca is and what you believe and what you think and what your philosophies around learning are. So you have a new role at Grantmakers for Education, and it is not only your new role, it is a new role at Grantmakers for Education as the Chief Program Officer. So based on, let's distill everything that you just talked about, and what is this new role going to look like, Ulcca?
That's a good question, Nora. So, it is a new role, and Celine and the board and the team, I think, had identified a desire to have it about a year and a half ago, because I think the aim has been for GFE's programming to be even richer and broader and sort of more attentive and responsive to the needs of members than it's been. And then the pandemic happened, so I was lucky enough to kind of get the opportunity to come into it a year later. But the point, I think, is for me to sort of work with the team and our members to kind of, at least for me, to zoom back a little bit and to say, who are our members? What are the big issues that emerged out of the Big Vision kind of survey that we did at the end of last year, the responses we got from that, the responses that we're getting to like the focus groups that we just did on racial equity and racial justice, right? To kind of, at least for me, to zoom back, kind of see the big themes and the big strands. And I always think of it as kind of like a picture. Like if we had to fill in lots of different programmatic pieces, some that are one-off conversations that are an hour, some that are a little bit longer term where you're sort of scaffolding and working with our members as they kind of get someplace where they want to go. If we're having opportunities for people to have the connections, build the relationships, build the collaborations that they want, right? If we think about all of those aims in our programs, how can we be thoughtful about putting together a new agenda that builds on what we've been doing and sort of tweak some of the pieces that that maybe just aren't working as well as we would like them to better serve our membership. So I think that is my role, and it's part of why we wanted to have this. I'm so sad that I came on when I wasn't able to go around the country and go to events and have wine with people and really talk with folks. But it's been great to be on Zoom calls and get to know our different kind of members, get to know their work, get to really kind of see some of the emerging themes. And I think we've touched on them in this conversation, which is who are we as philanthropists? In what ways have grant makers and philanthropy contributed to some of the challenges and opportunities that we kind of see in this moment? What does that mean for our work individually and collectively? So yeah, that's, over the next kind of few months, it's a combination of thinking about programming specifically, but then also GFE's strategic direction over the next kind of 3 to 5 years in terms of where we want to go as an organization.
Yeah, that tees up exactly, because we have, I think, Celine's on 300 plus members of Grantmakers for Education. That's a daunting task to try to get to know everyone. Are you going to be like, are you giving out your cell phone number, or how are members going to get to know you, and how will you get to know the members, and what's the best process to get to know them and to respond to them?
So I think we're trying to be really intentional about that. So yes, I've been trying to kind of reach out to members and schedule one-on-one meetings as soon as I can get on a plane and people are actually doing things. And maybe the first time that's going to happen is the conference in October. But I would love to be invited to sort of come to the events as Celine did when she first came on board, but to actually be there in person and have a chance to see what you're doing and take part in it. I myself am probably going to end up going to some, like to New York, to Boston, potentially to Austin for other things. So when I'm there, I will for sure reach out to members to let them know that I'll be there, would love to take meetings. And then we're trying to figure out the best way. And if folks have suggestions, would love to hear. But in what way can we create a process and create a mechanism for you as members, right, to really give us ideas, give us suggestions, give us your interests, but to really kind of give us the fodder that we need to sort of integrate into the thinking. So would invite you to do that. over LinkedIn, over cell phone, over email, whatever it takes. It's really important to me, and I think to all of us, that you know that this is a time for listening so that we can build this programming in ways that really meet your needs.
That's great. And then if anybody wants her cell phone number, I have it. So just reach out. I can give you her cell phone number. And you just got a shout out from Lakita. The Arts Education Impact Group loved it when you joined their recent meeting. So they gave you a shout out and said thank you.
And I enjoyed them. And the one thing I didn't say, I think, when I was there, but like, I was so excited to see the Arts Impact Group, right? I felt like I was a writer a long time ago. I suppose I just wrote a book, so I am. But I'm also an actor. It was a really big part of my life from 7th grade all the way through about like 5 years ago, when I finally decided I didn't have time to do theater anymore with 2 growing boys. But the arts feel like they are, they're pulled out so often from the rest of our programming, whether it's in school or life, right? It kind of sits in this bucket. And yet, to me, it is the place where, to circle back to the beginning of the conversation, we have opportunities, I think, to see the world, to experience other people, to experience situations that we wouldn't otherwise have access to in kind of new ways, and in ways that kind of grow our capacity to be empathetic, to become allies, right? To sit with and across difference in different ways. So just shout out to you all. I'm excited that you're there and can't wait to work more. Oh, really? There you go. Thank you, Rebecca.
And Rebecca really did just give out her cell phone number.
My cell phone number.
Lakita, I want to give a shout out to Lakita, because I think the arts have really lost a lot not being in person. And yet the creativity coming out of some of the arts organizations and their work with youth this last year has been nothing short of breathtaking. Yeah. So I want to give Lakita a shout out as well, because it's really breathtaking. So thank you, thank you, thank you. In any new role, it is tradition that we ask about your first 100 days. So Ulcca, what are you looking at in your first 100 days?
I can't even remember, but I think I'm almost 50 days into my first 100 days.
Oh, wow. Then we need some progress updates too.
I know. I'm working on it. So, a large part of the first kind of half of my first 100 days was to listen, was to learn from the team, from our members, from the conversations we were having about, what's been working for folks. If they could think ahead to 5 years from now, what would they be saying GFE was actually doing that was like super changing how they thought about their own work. So I've been doing a lot of that. What's really beautiful is that we have a really broad open canvas to paint on. And so there are a couple of ideas that I'm kind of going to dig into as we move into the summer. So we are really interested in the idea of a podcast. So moving from, because everybody's tired of Zoom calls, and we're probably not all going to be getting together in person as much as we want to. So how do we tell stories? How do we share knowledge, information, aspirations in different ways? So we thought we'd sort of throw our hat into the podcast ring, but I'm excited about that because I think, and I'm still thinking through the details of it, but how can we have layers to the topics for podcasts? How can we do a combination of kind of inspiring stories from our members for other members to learn from? How can we potentially introduce our members to aspiring new leaders in nonprofits or in the space that they should get to know? How can we potentially dig into new research or kind of provocative thinking? So that's one big piece that we're trying to do. I am going to be trying to, and we'd be super interested for folks who wanted to reach out to think about some informal things, right? It would normally be a happy hour, but it might have to be a happy hour where we bring our cups to the Zoom call, but for different groups, just a little bit more of a social gathering, whether it's people who are in their first philanthropic role to really learn from members who've been in the role for a while. What should you learn? If it's women, if it's people of color, BIPOC, kind of members of teams to kind of come together in affinity groups. So we're hoping to do some of that in the summer. And then I think just kind of pulling back to what I said before, which was how are we going to think about the next 6 months of programming in a coherent way? How do we make sure that racial justice and equity are a really deep part of that? And then how do we overlay the kind of 6 months onto this bigger strategic vision for GFE and how the programming is going to support that? So
I love that. I love that. And I've become a part of a few affinity groups this past year. And it really is wonderful because I love general meetings like this. And to get into deeper conversations with people who are thinking about the same things and challenging one another in a safe space, I think is really healthy. So thank you for doing that. I love that idea. We have a little under 15 minutes left, and I would love to open it up. I have a few more questions. As you can tell, Ulcca and I are accustomed to having long conversations. So I have a few more questions, but I would love to have anybody who has any questions, comments, anything you would like to suggest. We've got the Grantmakers for Education team on as well as Ulcca. So if there is anything you'd like people to hear, please open it up.
and I'm excited we have Rose Community Foundation, Maria. So also Denver based, I imagine. Colorado's in the house today.
I was gonna say, folks in Denver, we can totally do happy hour in person. Once you all feel comfortable doing that.
I'm comfortable. I am vaccinated fully.
Right, Maria.
And they
Thanks.
just opened it for young people too. So that's exciting. They're getting the 12 to 15-year-olds. So.
It is. I don't know if I can see hands raised, actually. Jesse, can I see hands raised? Or can you
You should
just
be able to, but
Okay.
no one's raising their hands right now.
Okay. And otherwise in the chat. So we'll give people just a little bit of space and give Ulcca a chance to breathe. Okay, well, let me do a soft pitch while we wait to see if anyone has more substantive questions. So what excites you right now? This is a hard time. And, you know, it was, I remember someone telling me that like we're all in the midst of a hurricane, we're just in different boats. And so I think this is a really hard time. And I know you, what excites you right now, Ulcca?
Personally or professionally, Nora?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, at both. So I will say, I mean, I'm super excited about my book coming out. It has been the work of like 15 years, it feels like, and you know, it's been the work of 5 years to kind of get it published. It was sort of a big ideas book that I think it wasn't the right time for it. And the part of the reason I'm excited about the book is because I really do think we're sitting at an inflection point where there's been an opening for different ways, new ways, more transformative ways of thinking and of funding and of doing our work to happen. And it feels like it's still a choice. We don't know which direction it's going to go. But I do think that the kind of conversations that we're having, the movements that we're seeing build up in different parts of our communities are all sort of pointing us right towards, I suppose, what MLK would say is kind of the, I don't know, like the moral arc of the universe, right, bends in a particular direction, and it feels like we're going there. I am excited about the world opening up. And I've been excited both for myself and other people in this last year, that it sort of feels like we've opened up space somehow, right? We're a culture that has been so go, go, go. We structure everything. We structure our time. We structure our interactions, our relationships. And I guess I'm excited to see where people come out at the end of this, both personally and professionally, having had a chance to maybe being forced to kind of sit back, take some space, take some stock about the things and the people and the ideas and the values that are important to them, and the ways in which that kind of opens up new conversations and new directions. So.
Love it. Well, that excites me. So thank you.
I'm also excited that it finally looks like May in Colorado. What do we have, like 4 snows or something over the last month? So I'm looking forward to that for sure. And I have a high schooler. I have a new high school student, which makes me feel old. I know he'll be starting high school next.
No. Oh my God.
No. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, we have nothing coming in yet. So we may be able to give people a few minutes back. Let me ask you one last question. So what makes you smile when you get up in the morning? I hope you smile.
Yeah, I do. I do smile in the morning. I think these days it's actually, it's that my kids still come in, not every day, but most days. They still come in and they want sort of like they want me to be around, which I know sounds really weird, but like, but for now that feels like such a precious thing.
You did just say you have a high schooler coming up, so
I
yeah.
did say that. I did say that. No, so that's one. And I just, I don't know, my village, right? Whether it's professional, personal, but it's just kind of knowing that that there's a lot of people, that there are a lot of people out there that care about the issues I care about, that are seeing opportunity and possibility and hope inside of the, tiredness and fatigue that I think we all feel. And so it just sort of feels like it's a new moment. I'll share this with you. So when the pandemic hit last year, a friend of mine who's an astrologer who lives in Steamboat, actually, she said that astrologers had been predicting that 2020 was going to be like this really like crazy year or whatever for a long time, something about the planets or clusters or something. And she said that they'd also been predicting that moving out of it was this like new kind of opening in a space. And so I think I kind of smile sometimes in the morning because I'm like, yeah, it feels like we're getting there.
It's a great way to think about it, knowing that there was a lot of trauma this last year and there is hope for the future. So I really love that. Thank you. And thank you. So the book is The Future of Smart. Look for it on CNN and MSNBC soon at bookstores near you. We have a tradition at Wend that we close our meetings. We don't just like close the Zoom app. So I'd like to invite all of you in the chat or take a shout. I'd love to have all of you use one word to give your impressions and your feelings right now at the end of our hour. So just start putting it into the chat or do a shout out. What is one word that you are feeling right now? Lucky, hopeful, inspired, intentional, inspired, grateful.
Thank you.
Excited. Wonderful. Well, I think you've got a lot of people in your corner. Thank you to Grantmakers for Education. Thank you for creating this position and bringing Ulcca on, but thank you for also being a center for all of us who are in this crazy world of philanthropy. You are much appreciated as a team. So thank you all very, very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Happy Thursday. Looking forward to a weekend.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
folks.
Nora.
Thank you all.
Nice to be together. Bye.
Bye.